Hello and welcome to today's Chambers webinar on how to rebuild the Colombian economy after COVID-19, investment opportunities in real estate, construction and agribusiness with Pinilla González y Prieto. My name is Jonathan Block and I am one of the deputy editors on the Latin America team here at Chambers and Partners. And I'm delighted to be joined today by a great panel. Let me just briefly introduce everyone. We have Julián Rojas, a partner in the Corporate and M&A department at Pinilla González y Prieto Abogados in Colombia. David Garzón, also a partner in the Public Law Department of Pinilla González and Prieto Abogados in Colombia. Ramiro Jaramillo, Vice President of Investments at Renewable Resources Group, and Alejo Cherbonco, Chief Investment Officer for Emerging Markets in the Americas at UBS Global Wealth Management, USA. So today's session will last approximately 60 minutes. If you would like to join in the conversation at any time, we are able to accept questions via the text box on your screen. And I will also remind you that you can access key resources belonging to today's session by the event resource box that you can see on your screen now. Should you have any technical issues at any time, please click the question mark button at the bottom of your screen, where you'll find some helpful tips. So let's move on to today's session. I'm going to hand over to Julián, who will provide an outline of the content of today's session. Julián.
Thank you, Jonathan. Where to begin? During the last year or so, the discussions have been held in Colombia, not only about the consequences of the pandemic, in both social and economic aspects, but also regarding which of the sectors called to take a step forward, not only to regain what has been lost, but also to foster the economic activity to levels expected for a country like ours. Although there are several key sectors for the country, we have identified 3 of them that we consider are the most likely to succeed in this road of the economic recuperations. These sectors are agribusiness, real estate, and infrastructure. Each of these sectors require not only a fair amount of capital, but also have a deep impact in the economy if we consider, for example, the labor force they require, all of them, and the way the money flows into the economy as a consequence of the activities related to. But why these sectors, you may ask? The numbers that I'm going to present will help us to understand better the importance of these activities in the Colombian economy. Talking about the construction, the sector, and here we exclude the infrastructure, contributes with almost 1.5 million employees. This represents almost 7.2% of the national workers. This is actually really huge. Regarding the infrastructure, between 2012 and 2020, almost 112 billion pesos were invested in infrastructure by the central government. During 2021, and as a part of the strategy to fight against the effects of COVID-19 in the economy, we expect closing contracts for more than 50 projects with a budget in the north of 9 billion pesos. This is almost 9% of the investment during the period of 2012 to 2020. So this is actually a really big program from the current government. In the matter of agribusiness, this sector was perhaps one of the few that grew up during 2020, almost 1.5% during the whole year. The following crops, and this is an important point, were especially relevant. Coffee with a 7.6% growth, sugar, 15.7% growth, and fruits such as avocado, orange, and mango with 14.8% growth. Today, we want to share with you our thoughts for a better understanding of opportunities in the sectors talking about the Colombian economy. First, Alejo will give us a general overview of both LATAM and the Colombian economy. Then David and I will discuss about some points that, according to our experience as legal advisors, foreign investors need to bear in mind when entering into the country. And last, Ramiro will share the vision of a foreign investor that has recently entered not only into Colombia, but also in other LATAM countries. As you said, Jonathan, we encourage all our guests to send questions through the platform. We'll try to answer them during the Q&A section. If that is not possible because of the time, we will come back to you after. Ramiro, David, and Alejo, and of course, Jonathan, thank you for the participation. And Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julian. So, Alejo, if we can begin with you, could you perhaps start us off by, as Julian was saying, providing a general economic overview with regards to South America generally and Colombia in particular? I mean, from your experiences, what are the main points that an investor needs to know in order to have a good understanding of the current economic situation in Colombia?
Absolutely, Jonathan. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. My name is Alejo Charwonco, dialing in from New York City. What I wanted to do is, in a way, summarize the answer to your question through an adaptation of, the old spaghetti Western title for the movie. In this case, I'm gonna focus on the good, the okay, and the could get ugly aspects of Latin America and Colombia. So starting with the good, it is important to recognize that the external environment that Latin America and Colombia experience today is quite good. Starting with the fact that the global economy is recovering, is opening up, all of which is leading to growing demand for products and services originating from Latin America, going into mostly developed markets, including the United States, Europe, and of course, to a certain extent, China. In addition, liquidity conditions are quite generous. Global monetary policy is supportive of the recovery, and I think this will continue to be the case even if we see some tweaks at the margin. You might have heard of the Federal Reserve of the United States wanting to taper its asset class purchase program. This will happen soon, but notwithstanding monetary conditions, liquidity will remain quite supportive. And lastly, commodity prices. We are talking about a strong increase in the price of raw materials globally. Important for the case of Colombia, we've seen a 40% increase in oil prices year to date, all of which is supportive. It's a nice tailwind to have when it comes to Latin America, when it comes to Colombia. Let me move on to the okay part of the situation. Look, the domestic recovery is going on just fine. Thinking about Colombia, mobility numbers indicate that the levels of mobility in the country are already back to pre-pandemic levels. Something similar can be seen in the largest economies in Latin America. Following one of the worst contractions of economic activity in the history of Colombia, we are seeing a nice rebound in 2021, something that will continue in 2022. This is supported by the fact that vaccination programs are advancing. As you might be aware of, almost half the Colombian population has today at least one dose of the vaccine. Lots of work to be done to get closer to, say, Chile, with 75% of the population with at least one dose, Brazil 65, Argentina 60, but nonetheless, this is good progress. And the reason I say the recovery is going okay is because there are some vulnerabilities in the background, right? I'm thinking about fiscal imbalances in Colombia that cost the country just a couple months ago its investment grade rating. It's now by and large considered a high yield country. These are structural issues that were partly addressed by the approval of the fiscal reform a couple days ago, but will remain something of a consideration for the next administration, since the fiscal reform has not completely taken care of this situation. And the other fragility has to do with inflation. Inflation is going up everywhere in the world. Colombia is no exception. And we're going to see the Central Bank of Colombia start hiking interest rates, most likely by the end of this month. And this will pour some cold water on the recovery. I'll wrap up with some words on what could get ugly potentially, and this is politics. We all know that Colombia has a presidential election scheduled to take place in May and potentially June of 2022. I think the experience of neighboring countries in the Pacific Alliance is humbling. One needs to be ready for whatever the future may bring. Peru, Chile, going through very significant political challenges of their own. There's no strong reason to believe that Colombia is any different, right? And so I think we should be ready for more turbulent waters on the political front in 2022 and potentially beyond. I pass it over to you, Jonathan.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Alejo. If we can stay with you for a moment. Although internally, construction, agribusiness, infrastructure have been presented as three of the main sectors for the purposes of economic recovery post-COVID, do you share that view? I mean, from what you've seen, are there additional sectors that need to be considered? Is there anything missing from this picture?
Absolutely. Look, I think Julian did a very good job at explaining in his intro remarks why these sectors are so important for the Colombian economy. He quoted concrete figures. So really not a lot of room for disagreement there. Let me just emphasize and put maybe infrastructure into a global emerging markets or Latin America context. I think what's quite remarkable of Colombia is the systematic approach to infrastructure investments, the cooperation with the private sector when it comes to driving this agenda forward. You'd be hard-pressed to find many other countries that have this, grand plans in terms of 4G, 5G, and we're not talking about cellular technology, as most likely people that are dialing in and aware of. These are major infrastructure packages that include roads, but over time are expected to broaden out to rail, air, river transportation projects. These medium-term packages are uncommon in the emerging markets and very much welcome. Of course, there's always a big gap between what's been planned and what's been delivered. We saw a big gap in terms of the 4G set of projects. And this is, almost inevitable in the universe of infrastructure investments. But nonetheless, this is a laudable effort, something that differentiates Colombia from the rest of Latin America and in many aspects from the rest of the emerging markets. Let me highlight maybe one more sector. I think financial services is always an essential one. Latin America continues to suffer from low levels of financial inclusion. In terms of its population, there's a lot of room for improvement there. The combination of finance and technology is an area that is gaining ground in Latin America and in Colombia. And I think if I had to mention one more, this could be a great tool that can help other sectors drive their agendas forward. So I wanted to maybe complement with some thoughts on financial services.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was very complete. David, if I can come to you next, could you highlight for us what the main issues are that may arise from the post-pandemic regulatory framework?
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, first of all, let me thank you for letting me be part of this panel and share some thoughts and ideas about what can happen in Colombia in the next few years. To answer your questions, I want to speak about risks. What I'm going to say may seem pretty obvious, but when you're conducting business and when you're making an investment, I believe that one of the main considerations that you have to assess a risk. You have to know the risk of the activity that you are going to perform. You have to assess that risk in order to establish whether you or other will assume or bear that risk. The issue with COVID is that nobody foresaw that risk. Nobody foresaw that a pandemic was going to hit and what effects will that pandemic bring. So we have here an issue with risk. So I believe that the main lesson that has to be learned by the people who are in charge of designing our legal and regulatory framework is how to manage and how to assess those unforeseeable risks. We have have a broader approach to risk, but this doesn't it doesn't go as far as COVID. You now have some pending threats that come from global warming, from example. So we have to have a more flexible framework in order to assess those risks. So to prove or to illustrate my point, I want to briefly explain what happened with infrastructure contracts here in Colombia. Bear in mind that since the early 90s in Colombia, we have a concession scheme that mainly depends on fees that are paid by the user of the infrastructure. What happened in Colombia in March 2020 and happened all over the world is that we have lower demand of the infrastructure. So there were not many cars in the roads. We didn't have planes on the airports. So the revenues decreased. That leads to a lot of issues. Mainly we have liquidity issues. We have issues regarding additional requirements related to health orders by the government. And I believe that the Colombian government, I think Alejo said it, is that the Colombian government adopted some measures that I believe are well-intended, and they were aiming to alleviate or mitigate the situation of the sector, but I think those measures were not enough. But we'll see how maybe we can speak about that later, but we see what the government can do in the future in order to mitigate those effects that I believe these are not short-term effects. COVID, I believe, will change our consuming patterns. So people are not going to fly that more often. So yeah, that's something that we have to be aware of. So those will be my initial reflection. We have to have a broader perspective on how to assess the risk. And that is an element or a factor that has to be taken into account by our regulators. And I pass it over to you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think this is a good time to bring in Julian. According to the data provided by the government, Julian, Colombia has seen record highs in the selling of housing projects in 2021. Was there a real impact of the COVID-19 pandemic for the long term? What do you think? Julian, I don't know if you're still on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, I was saying that actually it's a tricky one. And I think that it needs to be analyzed from different angles. Although I acknowledge that some part of the academia and, for example, government thinks that this is not the correct approach. I'm going to analyze these from three perspectives. First of all, from a sales perspective, it must be said that perhaps during the last 5 or 4 months, records has been broken, considering that builders are selling more homes than ever, including before the pandemic. For example, during August of 2021, and this was recently published by the Ministry of Housing, 20,300 houses were sold. And that number takes to the grand total for 2021 to 234,000 housing units. This is a complete record, and it generates an increase of almost 15% regarding the results of 2020. It is not happening the same with offices, warehouses, and commercial buildings. I think that those specific sectors are still adjusting to the new reality. So actually, we will need to see how it will react in the future with this idea of the new reality and things like that. Nevertheless, we do not think this reflects the reality of the sector, although I recognize government does. According to our analysis, this can be explained, talking about the housing, of course, first in the fact that many of the builders are fulfilling the obligations contained in contracts signed before the pandemic. So these are not new sales, but sales that they did it previously and that right now they are fulfilling the obligations that arose from the contract that they signed. And for example, from some new sales, but actually what they are doing is they are not generating new projects, but they are selling some of the inventories they have that they couldn't do it during the pandemic. Of course, needless to be said, this last point, the possibility for them to sell the inventories is really important thinking in their financial stability. Other angle is the financial perspective. And I'm talking about here about banks giving loans to both buyers and builders. In this point, it is necessary to bear in mind that as consequence of the pandemic, the Colombian government implemented provisions to allow debtors whether to suspend its payments and to refinance their debts without affecting their credit record. These benefits are about to come to an end. And why we think that this is an angle that we need to bear in mind. Because right now, markets are waiting for the results of the financial institutions when the before mentioned benefits come to an end. Only until then, we will be in position of clearly assess the impact that COVID had in the bank's balance sheet. And in doing so, we are going to see what are the new politics that they are going to implement in order to manage these new risks that as an infrastructure appear as consequence of a new reality after COVID-19. The last angle, and perhaps for us, this is the most accurate way in order to assess whether or not there was an impact of COVID-19 in the construction sector, is what we call the beginning of the constructions. Although we acknowledge this number has been hit by factors different than COVID. For example, historically, we have been having problems regarding the inclusion of land in urban perimeters or under conditions of being developed. It is true that during the last year, there was an important decrease in the number of initiation of projects. Why we think this is the most accurate angle to be able to assess whether or not there was or there is an important effect of COVID-19 in the construction sector. Essentially, because we find out that when a construction project begins its construction, money starts flowing into the economy in the form of buying materials, paying taxes, and paying salaries. So perhaps the idea of selling houses is not enough. We need to bear in mind this point also. There is a reason for optimism. We need to, for example, during 2021, 142,000 units, housing units started its construction. What it shows essentially that although the sector was hit, they start walking the path of recovery because, for example, this number I just gave you, it represents, I don't know, something like 15.8% more housing projects that starts its construction activities. So to recap, I'm sorry for taking this long to answer this question. It is possible to say that yes, the construction sector has been hit by the COVID, but perhaps the effects of this hit cannot be attributed entirely to the pandemic. Nevertheless, right now we can see we are, as I said before, start to walking the path of the recovery.
Fantastic, thank you. David, if I can come back to you, could you explain to us exactly what measures the government is adopting in order to prevent the failure of ongoing infrastructure projects that have perhaps been impacted by the pandemic?
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. As I said before, COVID represented to ongoing contracts declines on user demand that led to an impact on revenues. And with an impact on revenues, we have for those concessions liquidity problems. So those contractors saw some problems regarding the operation of the projects, the day-to-day of the projects, that in some cases led to some default to the lenders. I believe that at least here in Colombia, we didn't have some insolvency issues in big projects, but that could be a consequence. At the end, these problems could lead to a project failing. And I insist, nobody foresaw that risk. Colombia or Colombian law did have some remedies or provided some remedy for that kind of situation. In some of the concession contracts, specifically those 4-year road concession contracts, there was a provision that allowed the contractor to demand the revenue that was not received but was expected. However, the issue with these payments is that could only be granted in specific years of the concession. And in most concessions, that moment is still far away. So we still have that liquidity problem. After March 2020, the government adopted some measures that, as I said before, I think were adopted in a timely way, were well intended, but I think are not enough. For example, under Colombian law, the public-private partnership have a maximum term of 30 years. If the contractor proved that the decrease in the revenue was about 20% or more, that period of time of the contract can be extended. I believe that's a very good measure, and many PPPs had adopted for that solution. Also, there were some extensions in the concession of ports. There was a brief suspension of the enforcement of the obligation of the obligation of some contracts, and in some cases, the government was reimbursing some expenses that were related to the health regulation and requirements of the Ministry of Health. Also, and I think that's the more important and relevant option or measure that the government adopted, there are ongoing negotiations between the contractor and the agency that oversees here in Colombia all these concessions in order to review the financial models and reestablish the what we call the economic equilibrium of those contracts. I know that some of those negotiations have ended with a good result for both parties, some not, and we'll see what happens. I still don't know any case that has been brought before local courts, but we'll see what happened in those cases. There are some options that I know that the government is reviewing and is assessing if are adopted. Options that are free in quotations, that doesn't involve or don't involve any financial aid, like reducing performance requirements of the concession. Being more broad in the extension of the term of the contracts. As I said, it was only established for PPPs, for public-private partnerships. This comes from a 2012 law, but what happens with the concessions that come from before that year? But I think the government is doing a good work, doing a good job with this. We have to see what happens in the future. I believe that is my answer to that question. Thank you, Jonathan.
Excellent. Thanks, David. Julian, if I can come to you next then. So David's given us an overview of what the government has done. Maybe you could tell us if there are any contractual provisions that can be agreed to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. Julian, I think you're on mute again.
I have a problem with this idea of the microphone. No. I was telling you that actually I was thinking about this question, and the first point that I want to stress perhaps is that even considering the effects of the pandemic in the economy, and I think that this is applicable to all nations in the world, it cannot be said that the pandemic itself generate a total disruption of the legal system, or at least this happens for a Colombian perspective, or it didn't happen from a Colombian perspective. Now, although this is true, it is also true that perhaps the effect that COVID-19 have had in legal terms, talking about contracts, was the necessity to revisit, analyze, and in some cases adjust some of the clauses that lawyers, whether as an in-house counsel or as external advisors, usually include in the contracts that they draft. I'm going to give you some examples of these clauses that need to be revisited and in some cases redraft as consequence of the pandemic and of the new conditions generated as consequence both of the pandemic and the measures taken by governments in order to attack its effects. I think that perhaps the main point or the main discussion here in Colombia was the force majeure. Indeed, regarding that one, it was necessary to came back to the basics. In this sense, analysis about whether a situation like this can be considered as extraordinary and out of the control of the parties was the first point of the agenda. This assessment was helpful not only when advising a client with problems with the fulfillment of the obligations that arose from the specific contract during the pandemic or as consequence of the measures taken by the government, but also when signing a new one, considering that the new framework applicable to the parties. I'm going to give you some examples of these in a couple of minutes. Another analysis that was in effect or in order is the one related to the effect of lockdowns and the measures taken by governments to ease them regarding the execution of contract obligations. It is easy to regulate the consequences of a specific situation once it ends totally, like the lockdown. When the lockdown ends, you start producing, or that's the general idea, so it's easy to try to regulate this in a contract. Nevertheless, it is much more complex situation when you try to solve the puzzle that may include partial openings and supply problems, like the ones we faced, for example, during whole 2020 and perhaps part of 2021. Additionally, it is, and as I said, it is important to bear in mind that these lockdowns were lifted partially, and in some cases, it was not possible to reinitiate the activity instantly, considering the characteristic of a specific activity. These, at the end, affect for a longer period the possibility of the execution of some obligations under specific contracts. And here is where I'm going to give you some examples about perhaps the challenge that we are facing and how this can be used in the future for drafting contracts in any of the sectors that we have been talking about, or any other talking about specifically about Colombia. The effects of the pandemic, for example, are not the same for both agribusiness and construction. While the first one was seen as a strategic for government, and actually they tried to foster its activities to ensure a strong supply of food. This is perhaps one of the main measures taken by government at the beginning of the pandemic. The latest, the construction, saw all its activities to stop during lockdown. Basically because it was not seen until 3 or 4 months after as an essential activity, much more according to the importance that it has in the economy, rather than, for example, the necessity of housing for living and things like that. Additionally, once the lockdown measures were eased, the agribusiness sector essentially continued with its activities as usual, while for both construction and infrastructure, plans were implemented to return to activity and try to recover some of the time lost during that period. What I'm saying here is there is you have a lot of weapons, to put it in that way, when drafting a contract. But it is important to bear in mind that each sector has different activities, different approach, different necessities, and understanding that it's important to be able to draft correctly a contract. COVID-19 also has had impacts in the way in which contracts are currently drafted regarding the risk allocation. It can be said that standard clauses are usually included for a specific type of contracts: leases, supply agreements, sales contracts, and things like that. The problem with these standard clauses is that actually they were built under the assumption of a specific formula to allocate risk. This formula is usually accepted by a specific industry. A really interesting phenomenon we observe with our clients is that when facing a catastrophic event like COVID-19 was, for example, for Colombian economy, they were open to change that allocation regime to maintain balance for both parties in the execution of a contract. When doing so, of course, they open the doors to adjust those, for example, the consideration and penalty clauses, to include aspects like uncertainty or some of the economic effects caused by the pandemic as triggers of its effects or its determination in the contracts. I think that the examples I gave you, and I'm going to finish with this. The examples I just gave show some of the elements that more than ever needs to be considered by legal consultants or external advisors as us when drafting a contract. And perhaps the message I want to stress here is that there is no one-size-fits-all provision for risk allocation of the contracts. It never was, and this is especially true in a COVID-19 era. I think that's what I have to say, Jonathan.
Great, thank you very much. I think one thing I'll address actually both to David and also to you, Julian, is if you could explain from the legal standpoint if there have been any advancements in the safeguards that investors can rely on to protect their investments in Colombia.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Well, I believe that COVID led to advances in the rule of law in Colombia. There is a rule of law index that measures the adherence of, I think, around 120 countries to the principle of the rule of law. And the truth is Colombia has not been doing very well in that field. In the past couple of years has advanced in a position, but I believe the last report is from 2020. And well, still a lot of work has to be done. We are below average in most of the factors, but I believe that COVID has helped to advance in that field. And why is that? Why I'm saying that? Well, I haven't used my printer in around 18 months. And why is that important? I don't know if Julian shares that same opinion, but most of Colombian lawyers enjoy printing documents and signing the physical documents and going to the local courts to file a physical document and ask for a stamp in our copy. And yeah, that felt good. Well, that changed. The truth is that Colombian authorities and Colombian law have struggled for many years to change how the judicial proceedings are carried out. And one of the ways to reach that objective is digitalize all documents and files. And that effort was only truly successful when the pandemic hit. It was surprising that it was done in a short period of time. In a couple of weeks, we were already submitting our documents by mail or using some application of the judicial system in Colombia. Nowadays, most of Colombia judicial proceedings hardly use any paper, at least in civil matters and commercial matters. Maybe it's too soon to evaluate or assess how this impacted on Colombia justice system, but I think that according to our own experience and colleagues' experience, this has impacted on how fast the proceedings are being carried out. The index that I was talking about before, one of the lowest scores for Colombia comes from the unreasonable delays in how our disputes are solved. I'm speaking about judicial system. I'm not speaking of arbitration. That's another field. So, but I think this kind of measures aim to expedite these proceedings. So I think that's a good thing that resulted from the pandemic. And I believe that the same consideration can be applied in the proceedings that are carried out before agencies or administrative authorities. Mainly in the local level, not in the big cities, it was unthinkable to file something by email. Now, that's the rule of thumb. So we see an advancement on that matter. Yeah, maybe a final word that's not necessarily related to COVID, but we will see COVID disputes in the stage of the investor-state disputes. I think nowadays Colombia is new in this field. I think the first claims that were brought before international tribunals regarding investments, that was around 2016. Nowadays, we have around 15 cases or 16. Most of those are still pending. Those cases don't have any award. But in the 2 or 3 that we have an award, I know that is disputable, and it depends on who you ask. But on those cases, Colombia won. Yes, in one of those cases, the investor got a compensation, but they were asking for $600 million, and the compensation was only 20. I'm saying that because this speaks loudly about the rule of law in Colombia. I'm not necessarily agree on what was decided on those cases, but my opinion really don't matter. What matters is that an international tribunal said that in Colombia we have a reasonable respect or adherence to the rule of law. And when you're speaking about investment, that's an element to take into account.
Great.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. I'm conscious that time's against us, so I'm going to move on to the next topic so we can bring in Ramiro. Ramiro, I'm going to come to you and ask, having initiated activities in Colombia during the last year, could you maybe share some thoughts with us about what the main challenges associated with starting operations in the country are, and the growth opportunities that you've identified during the last year?
Definitely. Thanks, Jonathan. And first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be sharing this panel with everyone. So I think in general, you have the classic investing challenges that are not different from other countries in the region. And when I say that, I particularly referring to Chile, Peru, Mexico, which are the countries that I've been a participant in opening the first investments in those countries. So you have just to name a couple. So at the beginning, you need to establish a company that is normally a special purpose vehicle, and you have to come up with a perfect structure, the most efficient tax design of that SPV. And when we entered Colombia, that was not clear to us, and now we are looking back and we are having to change some stuff. But again, this is nothing different from other countries. I would say we did have a little bit more of a scrutiny in terms of opening bank accounts and creating the company itself in Colombia versus other countries, but nothing that it can be highlighted as a real challenge. One specific topic, given that we have been investing in agribusiness specifically, one key topic that has been more challenging and actually took a lot of time and probably, I would say, also some money is the due diligence process, specifically when buying real assets. As a lot of you may be aware, when you buy land in Colombia, you need to do an exhaustive work, especially going through the land titles and there is this process can take more time than what you see normally. The good thing though there is that we also had the good experience of finding good advisors and good partners to overcome these challenges. So one of the first thing we did when we arrived to Colombia was to find a law firm. And a good surprise to us is that this law firm, on top of being, that entity that helped us all the way through the investment process, they also became some sort of like not only legal advisor but also business advisor and helped us, overcome the challenges I just mentioned. In terms of growth opportunities, I guess one of the main reason that brought us to Colombia, although our process to trying to decide if we were going to enter into the country or not took probably like a year and a half or 2 years, was that we saw that there was an arbitrage between the risk that is perceived by outsiders and the real risk that exists once you are there. And we are glad to say now that so far has been true. We see in Colombia a country that is growing fast. We see a lot of, as Julian and Alejo were mentioned, there's a lot of money that is being invested in infrastructure. So, this not only provides additional fuel to the whole economy, but brings an additional value to investors like institutional investors like us. That is, you are not only investing in whatever business you're investing, but if it's real asset based, if you are buying land or real estate or something, that becomes a downside protection to you, because you know that even if the business itself or the operations don't go as planned, you will have an asset that is going to be increasing its value over time. We didn't see that before. You see that in Chile. In Chile, you can buy land and it grows 4 or 5% every year. We see Colombia becoming that, but the asset prices you are entering at are not do not marry to this downside protection. So we saw that arbitrage, and specifically in agribusiness, a key thing that Colombia has is, well, two things. The first one, given that it's close to the equator and all the topography it has, you can produce most of the months of the year, which is not true, but for some of the main, for example, fruit producers like Chile, Peru, or California. What I would also say is that one of the key things right now that you see going around in the investment community is sustainability. And when you think about sustainability, you think about water. You cannot forget water. And one thing that Colombia has versus these other countries is that you have access to natural water. You don't need to pump water from the ground. So that's an additional investment highlight that has only bought this arbitrage that I mentioned that we found in Colombia over other countries in the region. Thanks, John.
Great, thank you. Can I just ask you to comment briefly, just because you mentioned setting up and interacting with professionals? What about the legal market in Colombia? You think that professional training, etc., is a concern with foreign investment? What was your experience like?
I have to, and I'm happy to say this. It was our experience with the legal firms in Colombia. We have worked with a couple now, and it was completely above expectations. Usually a lot of people, especially in the US where I'm based, sometimes they don't think that going to countries like that are emerging markets, you will find, big integral firms that can provide a different portfolio of services and that can, as I mentioned, not only be your legal advisor, but your business advisor and accompany you through the investment process. So in general, I have to say, Colombia, the professionals you see at all levels, because I think that is very important, because you interact with people at different levels depending on the task, starting from very complicated negotiations of shareholders agreements that you usually do with partners at the firm, to the bottom of day-to-day corporate matters that are, I would say, as important as the negotiation of the shareholders agreement. We have had a pleasant surprise, and most importantly, we have seen that they not only know their the local industry inside out, but they also know what the standards of let's say an American investor needs. A lot of people have also worked in the US, so they understand perfectly that. So that combination has, I would say, have made our enter to Colombia a lot smoother than what we thought it was going to be.
Great, thank you. So this one you can take, or Alejo as well could comment here. So I want your perspectives on the short and medium term future for Colombia. Do you foresee any changes, considering there are presidential elections next year?
Do you want to go, Alejo, or should I?
Please, Ramiro, you can kick off.
Perfect. So look, we as any investor, and we have to look at the macroeconomics, and definitely I have to say that the election next year, it brings an additional risk to an investor in Colombia. I would say not for any specific reason, but because we think that it generally will affect the morale inside, and also the fact that other investors that are not already in Colombia, or they don't have operations in Colombia, they mostly see at macroeconomic, signals. This can impact the country overall. However, I would have to say though that now that we are in Colombia and seeing that for good or for bad, a big chunk of the Colombian economy is informal, we don't see this affecting significantly to industries like agribusiness or infrastructure, for instance. We believe that the asset prices are continue to increase. As I mentioned before, there are things that make Colombia unique. And again, going specifically to agribusiness, it's mostly an export business. So you even if the political side is not the ideal for investors, you would not see that in the P&L. So yeah, we are looking closely, but we are not. We don't think it's a major risk.
Great.
Maybe okay, to complement Jonathan on that point. So look, I think one needs to be realistic regarding what to expect in Colombia and in the Andean countries in general. If you're going to go into these countries investing, thinking that from an institutional, macroeconomic, and political perspective, the Andean region is what it was pre-pandemic, I think that's a mistake, right? I do think we will see a worsening in terms of growth dynamics, political volatility, institutional quality in coming years at the margin. This is not the end of the world. This is not a deal breaker, but I think we need to recognize that the pandemic hit a region with pre-existing conditions, and this will have long-lasting effects that you need to bake into your investment decisions.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, let's move on to the Q&A section of the webinar. The first question, which I will now send to the screen, which you can all see. Alejo, I'm going to stick with you so you can answer this one. A few months ago, the investment grade of Colombia was lost. What are the real consequences for the Colombian economy, bearing in mind the country's interest in attracting foreign investment?
Terrific. Thanks for the question. Let's start with the basics, right? What is investment grade? This refers to typically to the average rating of rating agencies Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. A rating BBB- or above is considered investment grade, or typically a country with higher credit worthiness. A rating of BB+ and below is considered high yield, a country with, all things equal, lower credit worthiness. Colombia was an investment grade country for the last decade. It's something it earned around the time of 2011 and preserved all the way to mid-2021. In May, Standard & Poor's cut Colombia's rating to below investment grade, and in July, Fitch followed by also cutting Colombia's rating to below investment grade. So today we have a Colombia that is squarely high yield, all right? This is not the end of the world. Colombia is still a very credit-worthy country. We think the probability of default of Colombia is extremely low. The country has good macroeconomic policy, but the loss of investment grade has consequences, right? And let me highlight 4 of them. First off, the pool of investors that might be willing to come to the country is smaller. Some investors are limited and can only invest in investment grade country. I'm thinking about some pension funds, some insurance companies. So that's one restriction in a way. Second, financing costs are likely to be higher. If you look at the last 10 years, investment grade countries at the BBB- rating have paid 1% less per year in financing costs at the government level than those in the BB+. So you're going to pay more to issue that. It's not dramatic, but it's a portion that you need to consider. Number 3, if the government has a lower rating, typically corporations, infrastructure projects are going to earn a lower rating because typically the government rating caps that of all other corporates and infrastructure projects. And finally, while you may lose investment grade relatively fast, regaining it takes quite a bit of time. Historically, it's faster to lose it than it is to regain it. So we need to, again, expect this to prevail, right? We're not going to go back to investment grade anytime soon.
Great, thank you. So the next question, which I think Ramiro can handle, in a turbulent situation caused by the pandemic with profound consequences for the economy, is it time to invest? According to your experience, is there appetite for investment in new projects?
Yes, thanks, Jonathan. So for us, we were part of that cycle. We entered right on the pandemic. We made our first acquisition, and what we have seen is that, although there's a lot of processes that are affected, you see supply chains that are, some sort of not efficient, and things are not going as smooth as you would want as a new investor. What we have seen though is a lot of opportunities, specifically growth opportunities coming along. Most of them from family businesses. So a lot of the big companies in some of the sectors in Colombia are familiar. And before the pandemic, when we started trying to source for deals and growth opportunities in Colombia, we saw some sort of rejection of somebody, an outsider interested in pouring some money in order to grow the business. Now, fortunately to say, given that there has been some situations of cash crunch in a lot of businesses, we have seen these families open to discuss growth opportunities and to take an additional investor to hear what they have to say in order to grow the company. So I would say, and another good thing is that you see also market prices more realistic. Before pandemic, Colombia was in a growth mode, and we saw at least land prices going all over the place. Now after COVID, we think expectations are getting realistic again. So we do think that is a buyer's market, especially for growth opportunities, more than just normal cash buyouts.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I think that's about all we have time for today. I really want to thank today's panel for their insights and also the audience for their questions. We have had quite a few questions that we haven't managed to get to, but we'll of course aim to follow up. In addition, should you have any further questions, please feel free to get in touch with Pinilla González y Prieto directly by using the contact box on your screen. So have a great rest of your day, everyone, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.